Good morning. Welcome to the class on the letter to the Ephesians. This is the Episcopal Church of the Redeemer on Tech Drive in Ruston, Louisiana in the United States. And you can find out more about our parish, our ecclesiastical parish, by going on the internet to www.rustonredeemer.org. This is a class of 11 sessions. And today is an introductory session on the letter to the Ephesians as a letter in the Pauline tradition. And I'll tell you what that means. And then as you look on the chart, particularly on the right-hand column, you'll see that we're going to proceed sequentially through Ephesians. And so March 30th, we'll talk about slavery and the Pauline tradition. By the way, in Philemon, Paul was harboring a fugitive slave. And so Paul was already in jail and he was harboring a fugitive slave. And he wrote the letter to Philemon to sort of say, well, the big question is, what did Paul really mean by that letter? But Philemon is a letter that only has 25 verses and only one chapter. And so we do have to talk about slavery and the Pauline tradition. And of course, you can read more about that in 1 Corinthians 7, where he says to slaves okay, you need to stay slaves. And so that's a big problem with Paul. Everybody needs to have a Bible or have access to a Bible. And I recommend that you use an accurate modern translation of the Bible, translated after the turn into the 20th century, from the 19th century at least. And of course, the New Revised Standard Version is good. That's what you hear in church. In most Episcopal churches, you would hear the NRSV because that's what's in our lectionaries, which is the book of the readings that we use in the 3 years. And then that came out in 1989, and then it was updated in 2021. And this is the study Bible. There was a thing called the HarperCollins Study Bible that the Society of Biblical Literature got the royalties from. It went through 2 editions. And the 3rd edition is called the SBL Study Bible. And it uses the NRSV UE, the update edition. So I recommend that. When they first brought this out, they put it on relatively thin paper. And there has been quite an uproar about that. But if you get one, make sure you get one that's not on this damnable thin paper, okay? The older RSV was in, the New Testament was in 1946 and the whole Bible in 1952. The Episcopal Church asked for the Apocrypha to be translated. And then in 1971, there was a 2nd edition of the New Testament, and that's what I went to seminary with. The Jerusalem Bible came out in 1966. And that was an English version of the La Bible de Jérusalem, which was put together by the École Biblique et Archéologique Française in Jerusalem, otherwise known as the French School. And so then they brought out a new edition of it called the New Jerusalem Bible in 1985. And in a program I taught, we used that as our study Bible. And then more recently, there is now a revised New Jerusalem Bible. Conservative evangelicals brought out something called the New International Version, the NIV. And the 2011 update is very good. Even if you're not a conservative evangelical, and I assure you I am not, it's a very quality translation. And then the New English Bible came out. The New Testament came out in the 60s, and the whole Bible came out in 1970. And it's very British in its English. And the Revised English Bible came out in 1989. And so these translations use the relatively accurate Greek text based on the manuscript discoveries of the 19th and 20th century. The King James Version and the New King James Version use the non-critical text. They use something called the Textus Receptus, which means the received text. And basically, they want to go with the majority of the manuscripts with all of the mistakes in the manuscripts. And so if you go with them, then you're ignoring the manuscripts that were found in the 19th century, which are from, or published in the 19th century, that were from the 4th and 5th centuries. And so those manuscript discoveries of Codex Vaticanus and Codex Alexandrinus and Codex Sinaiticus completely revolutionized the New Testament text, in that we now have the evidence of a text that certainly predated the text based on 10th century and later manuscripts, which is what the King James Version was based on. So we now have a better Greek text. The New Testament is a collection of collections of collections. If you believe me and my teacher, the Corinthian letters are a collection of Corinthian letters. And then the Pauline corpus is a collection of letters attributed to Paul. And then there are other collections in the New Testament. Most notably, the next earliest collection in the New Testament is the Gospels: Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, of which Mark was probably chronologically the first, and John was probably chronologically the last. And then the Pauline corpus is the neutral term that we use to indicate the 14 documents in the New Testament that are associated with the name of Paul and were transmitted together in the manuscript tradition. Several of them were actually dictated by Paul, like 7. And then several of them 6 of them were most likely not written by Paul, and the letter to the Hebrews was certainly not written by Paul. And so this has been intensely debated, which ones were by Paul and which ones were not by Paul. We still debate these things. And I'm a partisan in the debate. Anyway, the authentic letters, the letters that, the more diplomatic term now is the undisputed letters. And the undisputed letters are Romans, 1 and 2 Corinthians, Galatians, Philippians, 1 Thessalonians, and Philemon. They are, for the most part, completely undisputed that Paul wrote them. We don't have any doubts about them. There are a few people that do, but not many. And then the 3 Deutero-Pauline letters, the first one was most likely Colossians, and the writer of Ephesians had a copy of Colossians and made significant changes, not the greatest changes in the world, but some changes between Colossians and Ephesians, kind of like Matthew had a copy of Mark. And then 2 Thessalonians, that writer had a copy of 1 Thessalonians. And then those 3 are called the Deutero-Pauline letters. And then the pastoral letters are 1 Timothy, 2 Timothy, and Titus. And not many mainstream scholars would tell you they are by Paul. Some would, but not many. And then nobody respectable has thought that Hebrews is by Paul since Vatican II. The last respectable people that thought that Hebrews was written by Paul were Roman Catholic scholars who read that little decree of the Council of Trent that said Paul wrote 14 letters, and they believed that. And so after Vatican II, Roman Catholic scholars quietly dropped Pauline authorship of the letter to the Hebrews. And so the questions that are important to me, and they may not be important to you, but they are important to me, is where does the letter to the Ephesians fit historically, right? If it was written in the late 1st century, or even possibly the early 2nd century, it's a part of the Christian tradition. It's a part of the Pauline tradition, and so that makes it really important. It's in the New Testament. We believe it to be inspired. It's important. So I think it's important historically. It certainly is important theologically. And I would want you to tell me eventually why you think Ephesians is important to us now. And that's what I try to tell you when I stand in the pulpit, is what's important to us now. And I urge you to try to think of that as we go through this class. Okay? You may have other questions. And you also don't have to agree with me. The traditional answer as to where Ephesians fits historically is that Ephesians was written or dictated by Paul the Apostle. And so if the Apostle himself wrote the letter, it was written during his lifetime, which means that you have to date it before his death in 62. If you believe, or thereabouts, if you believe that Paul was executed in Rome while Nero was emperor. That's the traditional view. And it is a very believable view. There is another tradition that somebody wrote, that some held in the early church, that Paul went to Spain. But that's basically looking at Romans 15, 14 and following, where he says he wants to go to Spain. But we don't have any evidence that Paul did go to Spain, and there is a strong church tradition that Paul died under Nero, and he was put to death by beheading because he was a Roman citizen, and his body was dumped out on the Ostian Way outside Rome. And so over that place where his body was dumped out is now a papal basilica called the Papal Basilica of St. Paul outside the walls. And it is believed that the whatever earthly remains there are of Paul, they are buried there. And so before the Reformation, the Church of St. Paul outside the walls was the titular church of the Archbishop of Canterbury. And so there's a lot of interesting things that are to be said about the church of the Basilica of St. Paul outside the walls. By the way, if you think that Paul wrote it, and he died in 62, that means that Ephesians would have been written about the same time Romans was written, which was about 60. But if Ephesians is an authentic letter of Paul, it was while Paul was incarcerated. And the problem that you have is that there are two incarcerations of Paul. One is the Ephesian imprisonment, and the other is the Roman imprisonment, which led to his death. But if you think that Ephesians was written at about the same time as Romans was written, then you would reasonably expect that Paul's theology in this letter would be pretty much the same as Paul's theology in Romans. And that is very problematic, especially when you read Romans 8. And so the question is, where does it fit? And so there have been three big sets of issues which the majority of New Testament scholars have understood to point away from the authorship of the letter by Paul before his death in the 60s. And these three issues are literary, and you compare the words and phrases that Paul used in comparison to the other letters that Paul undoubtedly wrote, the historical evidence for when Ephesians was written, and the historical evidence is the quotations of those other letters in 1 Clement, the first letter of Clement. The Bishop of Rome, Clement, wrote a letter to the Corinthians telling them what they just did they can't do. And he quoted most of the Pauline letters. And there may be an allusion, if not a quote, of Ephesians in the first letter of Clement, which was written about 95 to 96. And then the whole issue is the theology, is whether Ephesians has the same theology as Paul. And I am of the strong opinion that it does not. The literary issues are important. There are 40 words that are not found elsewhere in the New Testament. We call that a hapax legomenon, and there are 40 hapax legomena. And then there are also 51 words which are not found in the Pauline letters that we don't have doubts about. And then a higher than normal number of hapax legomena, once used words, points most New Testament scholars away from authorship by Paul. Now, you may think Paul went out and bought a dictionary, except they didn't exist. But Ephesians uses diabolos, whereas Paul uses Satan. And Ephesians uses the odd phrase, in the heavenly places, 5 times. And it's also in Colossians. But Paul's Undisputed Letters uses that phrase not at all. That's just one example. And so more than 1/3 of the words which appear in Colossians are also used in Ephesians. So you have that many words that are common to Ephesians and Colossians, but not elsewhere used in Paul's letters. And therefore, For many reasons, Ephesians appears to have used Colossians as a written source. It could be the other way around, but most of us think Ephesians used Colossians. And here are the historical issues. In order to make a case for a Pauline authorship, you need to understand that there was a time in Paul's ministry in which it would make sense for Paul to have written this letter from prison. And based on the single Roman imprisonment recorded in Acts, this is difficult. By the way, if you think that Paul wrote the pastorals, you need Paul to have gotten out of the slammer and then gotten into the slammer again. You need a second Roman imprisonment. And if you believe that, think of yourself as the astronauts. And command control in Houston says to you over the radio, Apollo, you have just now left the orbit of the Earth, okay? Because if you say stuff about Paul and you're a traditional person, as you're traditional and very, very traditional, very conservative, then you want to you want to think that the writer of Acts was a companion of Paul and actually knew a lot about Paul. And so when you start saying there was this second Roman imprisonment of Paul, then you have left the orbit of the Earth, okay? And so you really don't have any hard evidence that Ephesians was written before the end of the first century CE. And it appears that the letters of Ignatius of Antioch, who wrote in about 110, reflect a knowledge of Ephesians. He was in the early 2nd century, and he wrote 7 letters on the way to his martyrdom in Rome. And so you don't actually have quotations from Ephesians that you can really demonstrate before Polycarp's letter to the Philippians, and you cannot date that before about 133. So you're talking about a 2nd century provenance. And if you say it's a 2nd century letter, then you've just taken it out of the Pauline column as to Pauline authorship. Is that clear enough? Okay. All right. If Paul died in 62. And so the other big deal is that Paul's letters have local details. They have details of the churches Paul is writing to. Even Romans has details of Paul's travel plans, and we know from other sources that there were multiple Roman congregations that Paul did not found. But instead of that, Ephesians doesn't have local details, right? Which is interesting if he founded the church in Ephesus. And so it doesn't seem to address a single local Christian community. And Fame Perkins of Boston University says its vision of the church is set in the largest possible framework, the cosmic body of all the faithful united with its head, the risen Christ, instead of the Ephesian congregation, see? And then she goes on to say, the cosmic picture of the church already united with the risen Christ shifts attention from the end-time coming of the Lord. So that's the big, big, big theological difference. Paul's letters talks about the second coming of the Lord that hasn't happened yet. And Ephesians speaks of we're already fully united with the Lord. We're already up in heaven with the Lord. And it says, Fame Perkins says, believers have been freed from the powers of darkness and raised up with Christ in the heavens. And that is in her commentary in the New Interpreter's Bible. And we have a copy of that here. And so the big theological issues is that what the undisputed letters of Paul consistently speak of as a reality that is coming in the future, the second coming of Jesus and the courtroom scene in the end of Romans 8. What Paul says is going to happen in the future, the letter to the Ephesians speaks of a reality in the present time. And that is a humongous, earth-shaking shift theologically, okay? So as a whole, given that there are literary, in other words, the actual writing and the words and all that used, historical and theological differences between Ephesians and the undisputed letters of Paul, The majority of New Testament scholars, especially Paul scholars, wishes to explain Ephesians not as a situational letter. See, Paul's letters are all situational, see? And we don't know what that situation is in Ephesians. But instead of looking at it not as a situational letter, actually written by Paul to a congregation that he knew about during his lifetime, but as rather a more general letter that is the result of theological reflection that is only likely to have taken place after Paul's death. And so the writer of Ephesians is most likely to have had a written copy of Colossians, as well as other New Testament writings, perhaps, such as 1 Peter. And so here are people that I know of who argue for Pauline authorship. I've met Frank Thielman, or I sat behind him at an SBL meeting. He's a tall fellow. T.K. Abbott was at Trinity College Dublin, which is the Protestant university in Dublin. B.F. Westcott was a professor at Cambridge, and he became Bishop of Durham after Bishop Lightfoot. Karl Staab taught in Würzburg, and he wrote a very famous book called Paulus Kommentare aus den Alten Kirche, Paul Commentaries from the Ancient Church. So he was really a patristic scholar. Marcus Barth was my teacher's teacher, or one of my teacher's teachers in seminary. He was the son of Karl Barth, and he taught at Pittsburgh. He taught at the University of Chicago, and then he taught at Pittsburgh Seminary. And then they created a position for him at the University of Basel in Switzerland. And then Art van Roon wrote a dissertation in the Netherlands, in Leiden. And then Frank Thielman teaches at the seminary at Samford University. And Douglas Campbell is a friend who teaches at Duke University. And he and I are about of the same vintage. We were in graduate school at the same time. He is a New Zealander who has taught in various places and now teaches, has tenure at Duke. And here are the commentaries and other books which argue against Pauline authorship. Here are their authors. Edgar Goodspeed wrote a book called The Meaning of Ephesians in 1937, and he made the best case against Pauline authorship. C. Leslie Mitten wrote a dissertation and taught in a Methodist theological college for many years and lived to a very ripe old age. And he wrote a dissertation about that thick in a published form that Oxford published, and then he wrote a very good commentary on Ephesians. Francis Wright Bear taught for years at the Faculty of Divinity in the Trinity College, Toronto, and was a president of the Society of Biblical Literature. And he wrote the commentary on Ephesians and Colossians and the pastorals in the older Interpreter's Bible, and they are excellent. Joachim Gnilke tried to invent a new term called deuteronymity as opposed to pseudonymity, and he taught at the University of Munich. Helmut Merklein, a little more conservative, taught at the University of Bonn in the Catholic faculty. Andreas Lindemann is now of retirement age, and he taught at the Kirchliche Hochschule in Bethel, Germany, in the Ruhr. Ray Collins is my co-editor of the series we're working on, and he taught at the Catholic University of America, and he wrote a monograph called Letters That Paul Did Not Write. And so he has written a commentary on all of the letters attributed to Paul which he doesn't think Paul wrote. I taught at Codrington College in affiliation with UWI. Andrew Lincoln, a fellow Anglican, taught at the University of Gloucestershire. Fame Perkins teaches at Boston College. Ernest Best, Patty Best, taught at the University of Glasgow. A friend of mine was one of his students, I think. Cynthia Briggs Kittredge taught and was dean of Episcopal Seminary of the Southwest, and I nominated her for membership in SNTS, and she is now a member. Georg Strecker I knew in Germany, and he died of prostate cancer and was a really fine scholar and organizer. He wrote a theology of the New Testament, which is magnificent. Niels Dahl taught at Oslo, and later he was stolen from Oslo by Yale. Udo Schnelle is a wonderful scholar, and he teaches at the Martin Luther Universität in Halle-Wittenberg in Germany. And then Charles H. Talbert is a relatively moderate to liberal Baptist scholar who taught for years and years at Wake Forest and now teaches or is now an emeritus in the Department of Religion at Baylor. So as you can see from the people on this page and the people on this page, there are respectable people holding both positions, okay? Very respectable people, and I know some of them. I know Andrew Lincoln. I know, I've met Frank Thielman, and I certainly know Douglas Campbell. I know Cynthia. I knew Strecker. I've met and listened to Udo Schnelle. And these other people, Edgar Goodspeed is before my time, and Leslie Minton is before my time, and Frank Baer is before my time. But he was a president of SBL. The only time SBL ever met in Canada, they met in Canada in his honor, okay? So you can see that the issue of Pauline authorship is a real issue, because it's not just a matter of, well, mine is better than yours or something like that. It's a matter of trying to identify the theology and the writing of Ephesians and seeing if we can find points of contact between that and the developing late first century, early second century church. We're not saying it's not inspired. We're saying, let's see where it fits theologically. Let's especially see where it sits historically. And so I think that does not denigrate Ephesians in the least, but rather I think that just as my teacher, Robert Jewett, spent a lifetime trying to identify the situational character of each of the Pauline letters, I want to try to identify the situational character of all of the other letters. If it's important to identify the situation of Corinthians and Romans and Galatians, why wouldn't it be equally important to try to identify the situation standing behind Ephesians? So I don't think I'm denigrating Paul or the letter, but I want to see where it fits historically. And that doesn't bother my theology in the least. But I have colleagues that does bother their theology. Okay. And so next week we will study the whole first chapter of Ephesians. So read Ephesians. Read the whole first chapter. And then when you look at verses 3 through 14, try not to complain too much about the fact that that's all one sentence. Well, if you want to complain, you can. Are there questions or comments or angry rebuttals that you would like to make? It's in the province that the Romans call Asia, A-S-I-A, Asia. And we today call that Asia Minor. And it's referred to as Asia Minor, and it's in the valley of the Lycus River. It's in the Lycus Valley. And so it's way further east than places like Rome, and it's east of Galatia. As you will see, Ephesians is written in the name of Paul, who is Jewish, and he talks about how God has also now included, we Jews, but he's now included you Gentiles. So it's what you see in Ephesians is, in fact, Marcus Spark wrote a monograph on Ephesians that was called The Broken Wall. And it talks about the wall of separation having been broken between Jews and Gentiles through Christ. So Ephesians is written to Gentile Christians, and it makes a big deal about saying, okay, now you're a part of God's family when previously you weren't because you were pagans. So it's written from the standpoint, or in the name of Paul, the Jew, who says, well, God is now including you Gentiles in this. And the wall of separation is now broken. That's a big part of what is said in Romans about about Jews and Gentiles. There was a wall of separation, and the wall is now broken. And that's one of the unique contributions of the letter to the Ephesians, is the unity of the church, including both Jews and Gentiles, which is certainly very much in the spirit of Paul in Romans 9 through 11. Romans 9 through 11 is written to Gentiles to include the Jews in the leadership of the church, and to say if they want to keep kosher, they can keep kosher. If you don't want to keep kosher, you don't have to keep kosher. But remember in 9 through 11 of Romans, he talks about there was originally this one natural olive tree, and then the Jews were the branches of the natural olive tree. And then through unbelief, some of those branches got hacked off. And then Gentiles, which are now part of the family of God, they weren't previously, but now they are in Christ, they have been grafted in to the natural olive tree. And so the analogy of the olive tree, the natural branches, and the new branches grafted in, that's one of the big features of Romans 9, 10, and 11. And that is part of the rhetoric of Paul to Gentile Christians to include Jews in the leadership of the church. Previously, Jews had been banned from the city of Rome under the edict of Claudius. Claudius died. And so now that Claudius is dead, Jews who had been in leadership in Christian congregations in Rome are now coming back. And it may be that some Gentiles didn't really want to have Jews in leadership positions in Roman congregations. See? So that is what Ephesians says about the broken wall, using a different analogy, is to a great extent in the same spirit as the analogy of the olive tree in Romans 9, 10, and 11, which is Paul's final letter. So basically, there are Jews in the Jewish Christians in the church, Jewish believers in Jesus in the church, and the majority of Christians in the church were never Jews. And in the first century, they didn't always get along. And so Paul is wanting them to get along. And that's, to a great extent, what Romans is about. And that issue apparently hadn't died by the time of Ephesians. It takes virtually everything that Paul wrote. Goodspeed said that the writer of Ephesians had the whole Pauline corpus, right? He didn't convince many colleagues of that. But it seems that, in my opinion, it takes what is important about Paul, namely the inclusion of Gentiles and Jews, the body of Christ, baptism as the single, unrepeatable initiation rite. All of these important things about Pauline congregations that were important during Paul's lifetime continued to be important after Paul's death. Paul was their father-founder who founded these Gentile congregations, according to Acts, including Ephesus. And so Ephesians is an attempt to update Paul, to take what is important and to bring it into line and to bring it to bear on contemporary problems, one of which is unity, or the lack thereof. All that stuff in Ephesians 4, there is one body and one spirit. There is one hope in God's call to us. One Lord, one faith, one baptism. One God and Father of all. Paul did not write those words, but they are very Pauline, as far as I know. Maybe he did write those words, and maybe a lot of what's in the Deutero-Pauline letters and the pastoral letters includes words and phrases that came from the lips of Paul, and people remembered it, even if they did not come from the letters of Paul. Remember, 95% or more of Paul's time, he wasn't writing letters. He was organizing and ministering in churches. He was preaching and teaching. And so there's a lot that was remembered in Pauline churches that is not in any Pauline letter. Some people believed a fellow named P.N. Harrison wrote a book. He was a British chap, and he wrote a book arguing that there were authentic Pauline fragments in the pastoral epistles, that thesis has largely been laid aside. But nonetheless, there's lots of Pauline tradition in Ephesians and Colossians and in the pastorals. It's just that we cannot put it under the pen of the first century Paul. As far as we have evidence, we are limited by the evidence we have. And when you start getting into the later parts of the New Testament, like the Gospel of John, the Deutero-Pauline letters, the pastoral letters, the Catholic epistles such as 1st and 2nd Peter and James and Jude, as well as later as other things, you're getting to a situation where there's a lot more shadow than there is light, in my opinion. So I have my opinion. I'm going to speak in favor of my opinion, and you don't have to agree. My best students always went head-to-head with me. I think that's great. So I'm going to teach it as a letter in the Pauline tradition, but I find it difficult. I find it, in order for you to believe that Paul really would say that we're up there with Christ in heaven now, that means you're talking about a different eschatology, the idea of what goes on at the last day and, second coming and all that. So I think that's a humongous shift. And of course, people who object to my view can say, well, maybe Paul could have made that shift with the second coming not coming. Somebody made that shift, either the writer of Ephesians who isn't Paul or the writer of the Ephesians who is Paul. So I think you can note the shift, and even if you're not sure about Pauline authorship, you can appreciate what was going on in Pauline churches in the later period. After, Paul wrote in the 30s. Paul was converted in the 30s. Jesus was crucified and resurrected in around 33. Paul was converted or called as an apostle shortly after 33. And he had a very long career and was probably put to death under Nero in about 62. So Paul was around for 30 years, the better part of 30 years. And so the people in those Pauline churches, which are basically Gentile churches, remembered a lot about St. Paul. And a lot of those memories find their way into the Deutero-Pauline letters and may well find their way into the book of Acts. So it's an open question. So I hope that you'll come and eat donuts and enjoy the questions along with me.